Okay, are we working?
Showing off. Don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? Showing off. Don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
Okay, good evening, everybody. How are we tonight? You ready for another chapter of the problem of slavery in Western culture? Ah, of course you are. Why would you not be? How could you not be? We are on chapter 12 tonight out of, I think it's 14. I keep forgetting how many chapters there are, but I think it's 14 plus an epilogue, and the epilogue is pretty short. So 15 an epilogue. So yeah, we will just jump right on into it. Oh, got to get the specs. Otherwise, I'm going to be reading out here. They got dusty. The cheaters. Okay, chapter 12. Religious sources of anti-slavery thought, collective guilt, private opinion, and commitment. In this chapter, we shall trace some of the effects of latitudinarian theology in New England and examine the special conditions in America that favored or inhibited the application of ideals of universal benevolence and human happiness to the problem of slavery. Then we may turn to explicit discussions of slavery by a number of British writers who illustrate the changing trends in Protestant thought which we have outlined thus far. Finally, after emphasizing the limitations of rationalistic theology as a source of reform, we shall consider the relevance of 18th century evangelicalism as a stimulus to individual commitment and decision. Latitudinarian theology had a delayed impact in the American colonies, and its implications were greatly altered by local circumstance and tradition. In America, there had been no Hobbes, no Mandeville, no core of deists bent on proving the superfluity of revelation. Even by the mid 18th century, many New Englanders detected atheism in rational apologies for revealed religion and regarded such devout writers as Tillotson and Samuel Clarke as purveyors of infidelity. But as Yale or William and Mary acquired miscellaneous collections of sermons, tracts, and moral philosophies, the lines of intellectual faction became obscure. Dangerous books carried no stamp of warning, and a young Calvinist like Ezra Stiles could read Shaftesbury with enthusiasm, not realizing that he was a deist. The great problem for colonial intellectuals was to digest a mass of free-floating ideas and reconcile them, if possible, with provincial traditions. There were two reasons why liberal theology had the profoundest effects in New England. The descendants of the Puritans possessed, of course, a coherent and well-established intellectual tradition, and within this tradition were rationalistic and humanistic tendencies which had never been nourished by a Hobbes or by the fanaticism of civil war, but which became fully manifest in the reaction to the Great Awakening of the 1740s. It was then that segments of the New England clergy discovered and assimilated the English Enlightenment. In opposing the claim that revivals were marks of God's special providence, they saw the relevance of the self-governing Newtonian world. In opposing the emotional orgies of itinerant preachers, they found solace in the calm rationalism of Locke, Tillotson, and Samuel Clarke. In opposing the revivalists' emphasis on man's utter depravity, they drew support from Daniel Whitby, John Taylor, James Foster, and Francis Hutcheson. The New England Arminians by no means abandoned belief in revelation or in the supernatural. In the beginning, they thought of themselves as simply defending the established order of churches and communities against ranting subversives who disparaged good character, depreciated moral conduct, and imparted delusions of superior sanctity to their converts from the lower classes. But Arminianism became essentially a moral protest against the principle of slavery in the doctrine of original sin. This doctrine lay at the very heart of both the Awakening and Jonathan Edwards' remarkable theology. Edwards' disciple, John Hopkins, Edwards' disciple, where did I get John? Oh, I jumped back up a line. Okay, sorry. Edwards' disciple Samuel Hopkins declared that he could not give up original sin without abandoning belief in Christianity. Edwards' theory of moral necessity, that is, that man must choose what he most desires, amounted to moral slavery only if natural man were deemed totally incapable of desiring virtue. And to such Arminians as Charles Chauncey, Samuel Webster, and Jonathan Mayhew, this doctrine was outrageous on two grounds. To say that unconverted men were incapable of choosing true virtue was to obliterate vital distinctions between right and wrong, justice and injustice, and hence to strike at the foundation of law and moral order. Furthermore, the entire covenant theology had rested on the assumption that God was a constitutional sovereign who acted in rational and predictable ways, and while the original Puritans had insisted that God was not subject to human standards of justice, the Arminians were confident that no benevolent ruler would condemn unborn generations to sin and eternal suffering. Samuel Webster was particularly concerned about infants who died before they had a chance to be regenerated. As John Taylor had shown, no one could justly be blamed for the fault of another when his own personal choice was not involved. If electors were not responsible for the crimes of their representatives, how could it be claimed that men were responsible for what Adam, their legal representative, had done so long ago? And even if one granted that men had inherited Adam's mortal flesh, it did not follow that his moral failings could be passed on by physical generation. The absurdity of the idea could be seen in Jonathan Edwards' vain attempt to find another argument and to rest his case for collective sin on obscure metaphysics. As Arminian thought crystallized in the 1750s, 2 points received particular emphasis. Benevolence was God's dominant characteristic. Humans' happiness was God's ultimate concern, and the deity promoted human happiness not by coercion, but by allowing men a freedom of choice, and an ability to distinguish right from wrong. Even those who made the wrong choice could be punished only according to the degree of their sin. In time, Charles Chauncey would conclude that no human failings could warrant perpetual suffering, and that God's infinite benevolence would lead ultimately to the liberation of all the sinners in hell. Such an altered view of the moral government of creation had an obvious bearing on the institution of slavery. The principle of inherited and perpetual servitude was clearly repugnant to an expanded belief in personal moral responsibility, in the benevolence of the Creator, and in the primacy of human happiness. Since these ideas filtered into the southern and middle colonies as well as New England, we might expect to find a direct connection between liberal theology and a widespread conviction that slavery was an intolerable evil. There was, however, a very great difference between holding beliefs which would make it difficult to justify slavery and feeling a personal commitment to do something about the problem. Nor was the difference simply a matter of personality. First of all, American colonists could not consider Negro slavery as a remote and exotic institution. They could not use it as a symbol of man's inhumanity to man, or of the abuse of innocent nature, without endangering accepted rationalizations and questioning the integrity of highly respected men. Religious liberalism made greatest headway among a mercantile elite who saw private property as the very cornerstone of a free and righteous society, and such men were acutely conscious that slaves were property. Enlightened New Englanders like Ezra Stiles and Moses Brown owned slaves as a matter of course, and while in the 1770s both men would give up their human property and later become abolitionist leaders, they took slavery as much for granted prior to the Revolution as did Thomas Jefferson. Then, too, beliefs in God's benevolence and man's capacity for virtue were often linked with the philosophy of whatever is right. Charles Chauncey, for example, accepted King's theory that apparent evils were essential parts of the harmony and continuity of being. Even pain and suffering, he felt, served a medicinal function and were accordingly part of the general good. If American readers of Pamela, looks like a title, agreed that one should not disdain the lowliest slave, quote, he's equally a link of nature's chain, end quote. They might conclude with another English writer that, quote, even partial ills, when wisely understood and well improved, become a general good, end quote. That one's weirdly written, sorry. Since human institutions were the products of uniform laws which promoted the maximum degree of happiness and reflected the wisdom and goodness of the Creator, it was inconceivable that the defects of slavery could be more than temporary maladjustments in the perfectly ordered and self-correcting universe. The attack on original sin undoubtedly weakened the view of slavery as a righteous punishment, but without a sense of the infinitude of sin and the absolute opposition between the depraved world and the city of God, it would be difficult to see any institution as an unmitigated evil. But in America, the problem of slavery had still another dimension. Colonists, even outside New England, tended to think of themselves as parties in covenant with God. They interpreted prosperity as the collective reward for faithfulness, which helped to cleanse wealth of the stain of self-seeking. National calamities were deserved rebukes for laxity in fulfilling the covenant's terms. In times of crisis, American colonists shared the ritual which was most highly developed in New England of setting aside days for humiliation, self-condemnation, and pleading for forgiveness. Far from being a mere formality, this tradition of confession and rededication provided a sense of unified purpose and gave moral coherence to the vicissitudes of colonial experience. The very separateness of the American colonists revitalized the Old Testament idea of a people charged with a special mission, and this, in turn, tempered the moral reassurance of a pope and provided a bulwark against the dark pessimism that Voltaire felt when contemplating a mere earthquake. The French and Indian War, for example, was obviously a punishment for decades of moral denigration to which Americans had been blinded by their pride in material growth. We have already seen how the war led Quakers to withdrawal and self-purgation and to a decision to rid their sect of slavery. The New England clergy were equally intent on self-reformation, but much of their energy was directed toward arousing a will to fight to the death. Countless sermons made it clear that the penalty for continuing sins and for laxness in resisting the popish enemy would be absolute and perpetual slavery. The war with France had scarcely ended when some colonists perceived a threat of enslavement from another source. The New England clergy, particularly the Arminians, had played an important role in introducing and disseminating the political theory of the Enlightenment. What is not sufficiently appreciated is that the idea of natural rights, limited power, and dutiful resistance to tyranny were incorporated within the traditional covenant theology. The high-handed measures of the British government were therefore not only violations of a sacred compact, but were clear evidence of America's national guilt and urgent need for reformation. The erosion of belief in original sin opened the way for an assertion of natural rights and an insistence on defining limitations of sovereignty, and yet the covenant psychology preserved a sense of unity in collective guilt, punishment, and destiny. The crisis with Britain in the 1760s gave the Arminian clergy a dedication of soul which their theology had nearly made impossible. They now discovered new ways of describing sin, moral duty, and the meaning of God's judgments. At the same time, the heirs of revivalism found ways of accepting notions of natural liberty and natural rights without abandoning their apocalyptic vision. It was for this reason that ministers of opposing persuasions could join in denouncing the Stamp Act, in portraying resistance as a sacred duty, and in calling for national humiliation and self-denial. The claim that compliance with British regulations would lead to certain slavery, which was repeated incessantly by Jonathan Mayhew, by his friend James Otis, and by numerous others, was far more than rhetoric. Not only was freedom dependent on a contractual limitation of power, but bondage was obviously the punishment designed by God for those who failed to meet their obligations. When Samuel Webster and James Otis turned to attack Negro slavery in the 1760s, it was not a simple matter of perceiving the inconsistency between perpetual servitude and a liberalism which had already undermined belief in original sin. No doubt religious liberalism had prepared the way, but the heirs of the Great Awakening, such as Samuel Hopkins, Levi Hart, and Jonathan Edwards, Jr., would become at least as ardent as the Arminians in the anti-slavery cause. What had happened by the 1760s was that a complex convergence of forces had led a few Americans to see that However free and virtuous individuals might be, the sins of a nation, God, why am I so itchy? The sins of a nation would be repaid in kind, and just as the punishment of taxes and commercial restraints continued, uh, sorry, I don't know why I'm so itchy. It's distracting. And just as the punishment of taxes and commercial restraints pointed to the sins of greed and luxury, so the threat of political bondage revealed the source of the colonists' deepest guilt. Having discussed certain broad trends in British Protestant thought, we may turn to a number of writers whose response to slavery illuminates the more general shift in values. Although he died in 1703, Thomas Tryon anticipated many concerns of later critics and represents a different world from that of Baxter, Godwin, or Sewell. Like John Wesley, he was profoundly influenced by the mysticism of Jacob Boehm. As a youth, he was kindled by the spark of Anabaptism. A primitivist, an astrologist, and a dietary faddist, he wrote an immensely popular tract called The Way to Health, which gave inspiration to Franklin's Poor Richard. Aphra Behn, who contributed to the literary vogue of primitivism and sensibility, addressed some lines to Thomas Tryon. In the 1660s, he spent some time in Barbados and accordingly had first-hand knowledge of Negro slavery. As Philotheos Physiologus, Physiologus Tryon published in 1684 Friendly Advice to the Gentlemen Planters of the East and West Indies. A large portion of this work consists of information on herbs and fruits and proper means of preserving one's health in the tropics. The sections on Negro slavery appear to be a confusing jumble of inconsistencies. By adopting the literary device of having Negroes voice their own complaints and outdo their masters in logical debate, Tryon foreshadowed both the cult of sensibility and primitivist attacks on the pretensions of Christian civilization. When English divines were just beginning to talk of tender passions and the moral sensitivity of uncorrupted man, Tryon portrayed a loving African mother being snatched from her helpless children, the anguish of the violent separation for a young husband and wife, the dreadful sufferings of the Middle Passage, and the sadistic torture and grinding labor in islands where there was no charity, but only poisonous tobacco and furious pride, sweet sugar, and most bitter ill nature. End quote. Oh, okay. Starting with poisonous and ending with bitter ill nature was a quote. I didn't realize. I missed the first. In all this, according to Tryon, there was not a shred of right or justice. Without American receivers, there would be no man-stealing in Africa or trade in slaves, and yet we were astonished to discover that Tryon's Sambo became reconciled with his master and promises to tell his fellows to be, quote, be obedient, humble, just, and respective of all their masters, end quote. So long as Negro slaves are treated like men, they will enjoy an quote-unquote unspeakable happiness. A closer look shows that while Tryon was genuinely concerned with the Negro's welfare, he saw no inherent conflict between slaveholding and a good conscience. He was also much impressed by the increased profit which American slavery brought the world. To understand these inconsistencies, we must ask what human bondage meant to a man who thought of sin and salvation in terms of sickness and health. For the starting point in Tryon's philosophy was a pristine and mystical harmony between nature and spirit, the terrestrial and the celestial. Whenever this original balance was broken, nature began secreting certain inner poisons which, quote, by a secret and sympathetical power, end quote, excited corresponding malignant forces in the celestial sphere. Sin, then, was a disease which brought its own retribution. The consumption of spirituous liquor or any unnatural diet would lead inevitably to the release of lustful passions, the corruption of nature, and final decay in the form of plagues and disasters. And while labor was essential to health and virtue, its misuse amounted to a quote unquote perpetual plague, which ate away at the life giving forces of nature. It was to illustrate this truth that Tryon fastened upon the dreadful excesses of Negro slavery. Tryon's obsession with Pythagorean mysticism, Pythagorean if you prefer, mysticism, should not blind us to the fact that he identified virtue with the balance and adjustment of nature. Through the voice of his imaginary Negro, he was able to express considerable hostility toward the values and manners of his own civilization. He could even use slavery as a powerful symbol of class exploitation. One Christian, the Negro points out, squanders in a day to gratify his lust what hundreds of slaves have produced by sweat and toil. Freed from the healthful discipline of work, the planter grows fat and gluttonous, and after debauching a pretty slave girl, he guzzles rum or brandy on his soft bed. But the Negroes dig and hoe under a scorching sun, driven by the lashes of fiends. At the sugar mills they work over copper cauldrons, inhaling the sulphurous fumes until some, in whom nature has been overcome, fall into the boiling syrup. America had often stimulated hope for an earthly paradise, but it could also stand for a terrestrial hell. The contrast between indolent planters and exploited slaves carried radical implications for a society which had by no means accepted labor and temperance as the duties of all men, and Tryon's Sambo, who was significantly the son of an African priest, made trenchant comments on the religion which permitted such violations of natural law. Christians, he says, are fond of making new martyrs while honoring those of the past, and of using religion to justify hatred, wrangling, killing, and persecution. Africans, he confesses, are ignorant of Latin and Greek, and have not learned to chop logic or construct ingenious syllogisms. Their only book was man himself, in whom could be found the true nature and properties of all being. From this source Negroes had learned all that man needs to know, to do as he would be done by, and they suspected that the more paint glass had on it, the more it would keep out the light. Sambo might well have been a student of the Cambridge Platonists. To the charge that Africans were naked savages, it could be said that men had felt no need for garments as long as they remained in an innocent state. To cover their shame, Europeans robbed thousands of animals of coats, and then adorned themselves with lace and finery that were more the mark of pride than virtue. And even so, they neither entered nor left the world with more ornament than the humble African. Negro women, unlike the lascivious ladies of Europe, were modest even in their nakedness. If Africans were polygamous, this was merely a custom and not a violation of nature like the adultery and whoredom which were everywhere countenanced in Europe. Africa, to be sure, could not boast of playhouses, of luxurious palaces, of cunning lawyers, or of tables loaded with rich and unnatural foods, but this was hardly evidence of depravity. In the end, Tryon recoiled from the implication that Negro slaves represented sinless nature exploited and corrupted by civilized Europe. Sambo says without explanation that if his people had not violated the pristine law of nature, they would never have been subjugated by Europeans. Nevertheless, Tryon made it clear that the sins of Africa did not justify the sins of Europe. Quote, "The cup of wrath," he warned, "is almost full." End quote. In the late 1730s, when Francis Hutcheson was working on his System of Moral Philosophy, arguments against slavery appeared in London Magazine and in a poem by Richard Savage. Benjamin Lay published his blistering attack on slaveholders, and the Darien Scots sent their famous anti-slavery petition to the Georgia trustees. Hutcheson may have been influenced by the growing knowledge of the brutalities of Negro slavery, which came in part from the published travel accounts of such men as Sir Hans Sloane and John Atkins. But his views on slavery were also a logical application of his moral philosophy, which was a culmination of many of the trends we have already discussed. The son and grandson of Presbyterian ministers, Hutcheson was early infected by the Arminianism of one of Samuel Clarke's disciples, and was then profoundly stirred by Shaftesbury's philosophy of benevolence, and which which became for him the very core of religion. As a professor at the University of Glasgow, he was a prime agent of the Scottish Enlightenment, and the founder of a school of moral philosophy which included his pupil and successor Adam Smith. The Scottish moralists strove to construct a theory of ethics which would be compatible with Lockean psychology and Newtonian physics. Yet early in his career, Hutcheson had directed attacks against Hobbes and Mandeville, and he and his followers, who were deeply stung by the probings of their countryman, David Hume, knew all too well that if ideas were derived from simple sensation, morality might be reducible to such non-moral sources as habit, association, and self-interest. Their chief aim, therefore, was to derive from self-evident intuitions principles which would preserve faith in individual responsibility and in the moral order of the world. In one form or another, the ideas of the Scottish moralists would become a vital part of the anti-slavery creed and would leave a deep imprint on French and German philosophy, as well as on American Protestantism. From self-analysis, Hutcheson concluded that man is a skillfully balanced mechanism of senses and passions. The internal sense of sympathy enables us to feel the suffering of others and to desire to relieve their distress without any quote-unquote artful views of advantage. Since this prosperity is particularly evident in women and small children, it cannot be the result of education. The internal moral sense perceives virtue as the eye perceives light, and after first giving approval to our own benevolent passions, it teaches us to approve the actions of others which stem from similar motives. Our delight in benevolence is an instinctive reflex. It is not dependent on reason or any anticipation of pleasure, and yet we have been so artfully contrived by our Creator that our subjective feelings correspond perfectly with an external and general good. For the benevolent passions we most approve are precisely those that promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people, and it is from our unqualified approbation of quote, calm, stable, universal goodwill to all, or the most extensive benevolence, end quote, a social force analogous to gravitation, that we derive our quote-unquote most direct notion of the deity. Hutcheson attempted then to link the innate moral sense with an objective principle of social utility. Man's natural tastes and inclinations served the public good. His vices arose not from sin, but from erroneous judgment or mistaken self-love. For as long as reason sifted out correct data to which the senses could respond, self-love could be balanced by benevolence and would serve its proper function. But suppose someone argued that slavery was necessary for the public welfare of a particular society. Compassionate men might very well sympathize with the slave's plight, but if moral action were not seen as conformity to an eternal law willed by God, or to a system of rational principles inherent in nature, then social utility must be the ultimate standard. And indeed, Hutcheson accused certain nations of being so, quote unquote, immoderately addicted to liberty and so blind to the public welfare that they failed to accept perpetual servitude as a highly useful punishment, since nothing was so effectual. Oh, man, sorry. So hot today. Maybe that's why I'm so itchy. Uh, since nothing was so effectual as slavery in promoting industry and restraining sloth, especially in the quote unquote lower conditions of society. It should be the quote ordinary punishment of such idle vagrants as, after proper admonitions and trials of temporary servitude, cannot be engaged to support themselves and their families by any useful labors. End quote. How then could Hutcheson preserve the connection between our instinctive benevolence and a utilitarianism that justified individual suffering in the interest of the general good? Was it the function of the moral sense, when properly tuned by reason, to give automatic approval to the most efficient social system, which, according to Hutcheson's friend, William King, was much like the system then in being? The answer is partly revealed in Hutcheson's arguments against Aristotle's theory of the natural slave. It's interesting. So in a way, if anyone, like, if you were to put that into effect now, anyone that's homeless could be enslaved to make them useful members of society, so to speak. That's interesting that he had that philosophy. Okay. Not supporting it or saying it's a good idea. I'm just saying interesting. No men, he pointed out, were devoid of a moral sense or of desires for liberty, property, and happiness. These universal capacities and desires gave men the natural rights to defend their lives and persons, to follow the dictates of their own consciences, and to pursue happiness. Such rights were perfect and unalienable. Because their violation could never be compatible with the general welfare. Differences in wisdom or talents were never so well defined that the public good would be served by making some men totally subordinate to others. If Hutcheson rejected natural law as something deducible from the eternal essences of being, he discovered it again in universal principles which were necessary for human happiness, and as natural law became less abstract and absolute, it could be applied more flexibly to human institutions. Armed with the cross-cut teeth of benevolence and utility, Hutcheson easily sawed through the conventional rationalizations for slavery. Nothing could be more absurd than the claim that sparing a life subjects the recipient and his offspring to the absolute will of the benefactor. Altruism is a sufficient motive for doctors, midwives, and soldiers who save our lives without the bribe of our perpetual service. And yet Hutcheson's doctrine of utility leaves a somewhat ragged edge. Self-love may not be necessary for the saving of lives, but men will not work voluntarily without the reward of property. It is only just, therefore, that an African whose life has been saved pay back in service, with reasonable interest, the expenses incurred in his maintenance and transportation to America, and this he should be able to do in 10 or 12 years, providing, as Hutcheson added, he is not among the 1/3 of his fellows who die. The enslavement of prisoners of war revolts the moral sense and is equally repugnant to the general interests of mankind. Even within an aggressor nation, a relatively small number of men are guilty of crime. The majority of soldiers have no choice but to fight, and under no circumstances are their children deserving of punishment. The burden of proving just title lies always with the owner of slaves, and this is particularly true when the origins of captivity are distant and obscure. Yet here again, utility has its backlash. In war, the important thing is to achieve specific objectives, and these may require reprisals and even the enslavement of innocent people. But while Hutcheson at times justified perpetual servitude on the ground of public welfare, he took pains to stress its limited character. The greatest happiness of the greatest number of people might be served by a lifetime of forced labor, but never by a violation of a person's freedom of conscience or right of self-defense. In substance, Hutcheson said little about slavery that had not been said before. He was less radical than Albornoz or Bowden. Although he attacked some of the ancient arguments for human bondage, he did not hold that the moral sense was subject to progressive improvement. His ethical system made no allowance for a compelling obligation to combat evil, and yet he suggested the seminal idea that absolute bondage might be contrary to the general principles that promote human happiness. This insight would be developed by Adam Smith and the physiocrats. He preached the universality of benevolence and held that our sympathy for the most remote members of our species was proof of our disinterested virtue. Above all, he popularized the view that the essence of morality lies in man's instinctive and unpremeditated compassion for his fellow creatures. James Foster was a famous dissenting preacher who propagated many of Hutcheson's ideas. His discourses on all the principal branches of natural religion and social virtue, which appeared between 1749 and 1752, was widely admired in Britain and America. By that time, latitudinarian religion had become so infused with nature and reason that the Bible could be treated as a useful supplement. Mankind formed a great system, "linked together by inviolable bonds of reason, instinct, and interest," And Foster cautioned, "if the gospel, instead of confirming, had abrogated the common ties of human nature, it would be both impiety and inhumanity to embrace it." Foster differed little from Hutcheson on the natural rights of all men or on the usefulness of self-love when balanced by benevolence. He gave particular attention to the reciprocal duties of the various ranks and orders of men, and justified social inequality on the ultimate grounds of utility and happiness. "Whatever tends to mischief upon the whole," he wrote, "is an unnatural relation, and ought to be forever abolished." Hutcheson could have said the same, but Foster carried the doctrine of universal tendency to a point which anticipated Kant. The single rule for judging morality was this: "If all men acted as one vicious man thinks himself at liberty to act, what would be the result upon the whole?" Since servitude arose from the same purposeful causes that produced inequality, it could not be an unnatural relation. Yet here Foster confronted a dilemma. Even more than Hutcheson, he favored limited power and government by consent. Perpetual servitude in any form appeared to be a deviation from the divine scheme in which individuals were free in order to be rational, and were allowed "to exert the capacities of their nature without reserve." But Foster hesitated to restrict the principle of utility by declaring that slavery must always be incompatible with the general good. He agreed with Hutcheson that extreme measures were sometimes necessary in achieving the aims of war, although from a personal standpoint the freeing of a captive would give us much more, quote, sublime and exquisite pleasure, end quote, than keeping him in degrading bondage. Foster went on to say that whereas commerce should extend benevolence and, quote, a more universal sense of morality, end quote, the African slave trade was an, quote, outrageous violation of natural rights, end quote. If he should read of such cruelty, if we should read of such cruelty and tyranny in accounts of the ancient Greeks and Romans, we should, quote, despise all their pretended refinements of morality, end quote. But this, Foster admitted, was only a personal opinion, a quote-unquote private protest. The moral sense had not yet found a social outlet. Nevertheless, within the next 2 decades, the private protest against slavery increasingly became a test of religious sincerity. James Beattie, a Scottish philosopher who won immense fame for supposedly demolishing the arguments of Hume, saw the defense of slavery as one of the consequences of religious skepticism. In defending the, quote, immutability of moral sentiment, end quote, against the spreading poisons of doubt and disbelief, he took time to show that perpetual bondage was contrary to the British love of liberty and to the sacred rights of mankind. But though Beattie gathered material for a more specific indictment, he decided to confine his opinions to the classroom. And when Parliament finally took up the question of the slave trade, he favored the utmost caution. In 1766, the year before Beattie finished his celebrated Essay on Truth, Bishop William Warburton told the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel that the great idol of American colonists was, quote unquote, the god of gain. These, quote, sincere worshippers of Mammon, end quote, claimed that Negroes were a species of property. And again, quote unquote, gracious God. The good bishop exclaimed, quote, to talk, as in herds of cattle, of property is in rational creatures, end quote. Although Warburton was somewhat latitudinarian in his beliefs, and was an intimate friend of Pope, he had an arrogant contempt for deists as well as Methodists. Like Morgan Godwin, he associated American slavery with luxury, declining faith, and infidelity. Like Richard Baxter, he feared that Catholics were winning in the struggle for heathen souls. He attacked the injustice of slavery in terms reminiscent of Albornoz. Quote, did your slaves ever complain to you of their unhappiness amidst their native woods and deserts? End quote. And yet Warburton offered no specific proposals. His final suggestion was that Colonel Codrington's gift of the Barbadian plantations showed that God intended the SPG to be the instrument to produce good from so much evil. All of a sudden I'm struggling a little bit. Sorry. We've got 9 pages to go. I think I looked earlier. Yeah. All right. No one went further than William Paley, the Archdeacon of Carlisle, in demonstrating how good comes from apparent evil. With Paley, Hutchinson's utilitarianism triumphs over sentiment. Every bone, tendon, and impulse shows the wisdom of our Creator, who, Paley assures us, would have won first prize had there been a competitive examination for the best model of a reptile. Even heaven and hell performed the vital function of balancing human desires, and hence of promoting the greatest possible happiness. Now, in such a delicately contrived world as Paley acknowledges, there can be no basis for claiming that human slavery is illegal. so long as it serves a purpose, such as being a proportionate penalty for a given crime, there can be no objection, which is probably the philosophy they had when they did the, 13th Amendment, where they said slavery was outlawed or forced labor was outlawed except in the case of prisoners. Um, Early Christians accepted even harmful kinds of slavery, for to have done otherwise would have been inexpedient, and might have endangered the spread of the faith. Yet no one had proved the usefulness of modern slavery, which unquestionably brought war and anarchy to Africa, and a tyrannical system to America. Paley's doctrine of utility acquires its cutting edge from the forward motion of history. Quote, and this is a long quote, "The great revolution which seems preparing in the Western world may probably conduce, and who knows, but that it is designed to accelerate the fall of this abominable tyranny, and when this contest, and the passions that attend it, are no more, there will succeed a season for reflecting whether a legislature which had so long lent its assistance to the support of an institution replete with human misery was fit to be trusted with an empire the most extensive that ever obtained in any age or quarter of the world." End quote. By 1785, when these words were published, anti-slavery already provided a meeting ground for men whose beliefs ranged from orthodox to Quaker and Unitarian. Because British Protestantism had absorbed so much rationalism and had rested its case against skepticism on man's benevolence and capacity for progress, British abolitionists could sound like radical philosophers and yet think of themselves as vindicators of religion. As we have suggested, however, the very latitudinarianism, say that 6 times fast, latitudinarianism, which gave man a more favorable picture of himself and the world, furnished little basis for more than a private protest against evils that had lost the infinite horror of sin. A fully developed anti-slavery movement could hardly arise from a subjective sentimentalism as a frigid utilitarianism without the stimulus of a new apocalypse. In the early 1770s, John Wesley read a good bit of moral philosophy and was deeply troubled by what he discovered. He could not even enjoy Captain Cook's Voyages, which he started to read with quote-unquote huge expectation. The stories were absolutely incredible. Quote, "Men and women coupling together in the face of the sun and in the sight of scores of people. Hume or Voltaire might believe this, but I cannot." End quote. Wesley was not so incredulous, however, when he came upon a pamphlet by Anthony Benezet, quote, "an honest Quaker," on that execrable sum of all villainies commonly called the slave trade. "I read of nothing like it in the heathen world, whether ancient or modern, and it infinitely exceeds in every instance of barbarity whatever Christian slaves suffer in Mohammedan countries." End quote. When Wesley turned in 1774 to write his own tract on Negro slavery, he quoted descriptions of Africa which gave an, quote, "image of pure nature," end quote, and which revived, quote, "the idea of our first parents, and the world in its primitive state," end quote. These native Africans did not couple together in the face of the sun, but rather behaved like potential Methodists. If they spent perhaps too much time reclining at ease in their lovely paradise, they punished adultery with proper severity and worshipped God regularly. They were capable of that moral sensibility which Wesley failed to find in the captain of the slave ships. Quote, Do you never feel another's pain? Have you no sympathy, no pity for the miserable? When you saw the flowing eyes, the heaving breasts, or the bleeding sides of tortured limbs of your fellow creatures, was you a stone or a brute? Did not one tear drop from your eye? End quote. Even after the most unspeakable hardships, the slaves retained an acute degree of human feeling, and in America one might see, quote, mothers hanging over their daughters, bedewing their naked breasts with tears, and daughters clinging to their parents till the whipper soon obliges them to part. End quote. To primitivism and sensibility, Wesley added an idea derived from deductive science. Since the same causes always produce similar effects, quote, the dreadful consequence of slavery is the same amongst every people and in every nation where it prevails. No argument of utility could justify debasing a rational creature to the level of a brute. Like the Abbé Raynal, Wesley would prefer that the West Indies remain uncultivated or be, quote, sunk in the depth of the sea, than that they should be cultivated at so high a price as the violation of justice, mercy, and truth, end quote. But Wesley's most compelling thoughts had nothing to do with reason or nature. His ultimate message was that the sins of this world would soon be judged. Every merchant, every investor, every owner of American property was deeply involved in guilt. Quote, thy hands, thy bed, thy furniture, thy house, thy lands are at present stained with blood. End quote. The time for repentance was at hand, and repentance could only be shown by emancipating the Negro slaves. While Wesley's pamphlet was no less a part of the anti-slavery movement than earlier works of Woolman, Sharp, and Benezet, he had included it. We have included it here because it represents a religious source of abolitionism that we have not yet discussed. On the surface, it would appear that the Methodist and evangelical movements had nothing to contribute to secular reform. The trend toward natural religion, which did so much to enlarge views of human rights and capabilities, was one of the chief targets of the revivalists. They were revolting not only against moral decay and the laxness of a worldly and self-contented clergy, but also against the entire drift of British thought from Locke and Tillotson to Shaftesbury, Bolingbroke, and Hutcheson. When it became difficult to distinguish supposedly orthodox divines from the most disreputable deists, it was clear that old doctrines had been drained of all meaning, and that theology had become a lifeless exercise in abstract speculation. But in another sense, the revivalists attempted to reinvigorate traditional beliefs and to find new symbols and methods to express human emotions. Was closely related to certain trends in natural religion. Methodists were not the only men of their age to be racked with doubt and the fear of meaninglessness, to turn inward to their non-rational experience in search of moral certainty, or to place great value in sincerity, earnestness, and a life of useful service. But with the revivalists, these impulses were raised to a heightened pitch, and proceeded from what Sir James Stephen called a, quote, tension of the soul which admitted neither lassitude nor relaxation, end quote. And of course, they interpreted man's predicament within the old framework of sin and grace, and consequently spoke a language which was meaningful to those who had never heard of Locke or David Hume. In the philosophy of benevolence was if the philosophy of benevolence was associated with an expanded view of man's capacity for virtue, the very core of evangelicism was a renewed conviction of original sin. One of the reasons why early Methodists shocked their contemporaries and were accused of being Puritan zealots was that they really believed in a doctrine which had long been smothered by sweet reassurances. To some extent, this rediscovery of man's utter alienation from the sources of righteousness fortified traditional sanctions for slavery. But now sin was not conceived primarily as a metaphysical corruption or even as a judicial punishment. William Law, who left so deep an impression on Wesley's generation, spoke of the shallowness and insufficiency of what most men considered a devout life. For Wesley, sin was above all a psychological fact which one discovered as he became discontented with himself and began to struggle against evil inclinations. It by no means diminished personal responsibility or prevented even natural men, thanks to the mercy of quote unquote prevenient grace, from knowing the spirit of the law or seeking repentance and justification. As an Arminian, Wesley held that Christ had died for all men, and that only those who willfully resisted salvation could be condemned to eternal bondage in hell. George Whitefield, who accepted the institution of Negro slavery, thought that man's sin was so vile that God saved only a predestined few. Yet Whitefield used dramatic preaching to change men's dispositions, and the Calvinistic followers of Jonathan Edwards increasingly defined sin as selfishness. While some philosophers were coming to see self-interest as a positive and calculable force which turned the wheels of society, for many evangelicals it became the very essence of sin, and men who thought that self-interest was a source of indeterminate evil could hardly believe that a planter's concern for his own property was an adequate protection for his slaves. When sin was interpreted as self-centeredness, true virtue was to be found in a transcendence of the self, or in Edwards' terms, in a disposition of love, quote unquote, being in general. In effect, therefore, the reaffirmation of original sin did not necessarily mean a repudiation of the philosophy of benevolence. In Edwards' accounts of excuse me. Wow, that hit me quick. In Edwards' account of regenerated man, Hutcheson's moral sense is simply spiritualized and raised to a higher level. The saint automatically delights in benevolence and holy beauty and recoils from sin. Although Edwards did his utmost to keep holiness distinct from human notions of morality, his so-called new divinity was slowly permeated with the ideas of its Arminian opponents. For Edwards' son, the ultimate purpose of creation was human happiness. For Samuel Hopkins, true virtue lay in disinterested benevolence toward mankind. Benevolence, or a habitual disposition of love, was also the ultimate ideal of Methodism. Wesley described new birth as an instantaneous transformation of the soul. He distinguished, however, a number of logical and temporal stages in the drama of salvation. Grace was free and boundless, which meant that any man, regardless of his sins or station in life, was potentially capable of holiness. After a period of contrition and inner struggle, he might suddenly be liberated from the guilt of his sins. This external justification brought profound inner changes, which for Wesley were the vital heart of religion. Sanctification meant the restoration of the soul to its quote-unquote primitive health, to its original freedom for growth toward perfection. This new birth did not result in a complete eradication of sin or in a freedom from moral law. A man might be assured of his own sanctity, but he might also fall from the state of grace. There was an obligation then to strive toward perfect love and holiness, and good works were both signs and conditions of this gradual progress. The conviction that man might actually achieve a sanctified life was the power which lay behind the Methodists' remarkable organizational activity. sorry. Um, the love feasts and watch nights that gave social expression to the converts' deepest yearnings, the joyful hymn singing, the outpouring of printed tracts, and the open air preaching which brought tears to the sooty eyes of thousands of British miners. Most of the evangelicals within the Church of England did not share Wesley's faith in perfectionism. The aristocrats who clustered around Lady Huntingdon and listened to Whitefield at her invitation were unsympathetic to the idea of any collier that any collier might be a saint. Even the clergy who had begun independently to preach of sin and the forgiveness of Christ were troubled by the Methodists' invasion of local parishes and by their challenge to church discipline and order. But despite differences in doctrine and policy, Methodists, evangelicals, and American revivalists were engaged in a similar revolt against abstract and ossified theology. They strove to awaken men to the inadequacy of a worldly life and to make the quest for true holiness a constant concern. They held up a common ideal of piety typified by such saintly men as David Brainerd, the American missionary and associate of Jonathan Edwards, and they associated sanctity with a selfless effort to save the millions who lived in darkness and poverty. Because 18th century revivalism was international and was preoccupied with similar problems of religious apathy and social upheaval, it produced complex patterns of influence and reaction which no historian has yet unraveled. But even if we should conclude that there were certain similar tendencies in evangelicism, the philosophy of benevolence, and the literary quest for sensibility and the sublime, which has this to do, or what has this to do with Negro slavery? Revivalism did not lead automatically to pleas for emancipation. Religious conviction did not keep Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards from owning slaves, nor did it alter the views of the evangelical president of the Board of Trade, Lord Dartmouth. John Newton did not abandon his quote-unquote genteel employment as captain of a slave ship when he became a pious Christian. He simply ran a tighter ship and had divine communion on deck, while the Negroes groaned in their chains below. In America, to be sure, the Great Awakening reinvigorated the belief in spiritual equality and increased the number of Negro slaves in Christian fellowship. Preachers like Samuel Davies, the leader of the Presbyterian revival in Virginia, made a special effort to convert slaves, but never doubted the compatibility of servitude with Christian liberty. By the time of the Revolution, a master might have various motives for freeing his slaves. It would appear that a few Methodists were persuaded by Wesley's uncompromising stand, yet Thomas Coke discovered that his life would be in constant peril during his American missions unless he moderated Wesley's anti-slavery principles, and other Methodist leaders would soon find that the issue was far too delicate for a church which was primarily concerned with conversion and expansion. The main thrust of the 18th century revivalism ended with the missionary, not the abolitionist. There was an important connection between evangelical religion and anti-slavery, but it was generally blurred, as in the case of Wesley, by an intermixture of mild rationalism, primitivism, and sensibility. Early abolitionist leaders tended to be men who had absorbed many of the latitudinarian values, but who were emotionally inspired by the evangelical revivals. Even Quakers and Unitarians could not help but be impressed by the astonishing success of Methodist organization and publicity, by groups of quote quote-unquote earnest Christians who were united by the highest ideals of purity and benevolence, and by the thought that if the lives of so many people could be transformed in so short a time, the millennium might indeed be at hand. But above all, revivalism provided a model of personal decision and commitment. When John Newton finally chose to denounce the slave trade, it was not to express a private opinion or even to enlighten the general public. No other evangelical minister had established such a record of ascent from depravity. Early in life, Newton had been corrupted by reading Shaftesbury and had become a free thinker who made sport of God. As a sailor, he had been toughened by merciless flogging and by being cast in chains. He had been, by his own confession, the quote unquote willing slave of every evil, which included sexual indulgence on the coast of Africa. But after reading Young's Night Thoughts and surviving a terrifying storm at sea, Newton became increasingly devout. Illness required him to leave the slave trade, and his inclination toward the ministry was reinforced by hearing Whitefield preach. But while Newton used his experiences in the Guinea trade to symbolize his early depravity, his upward climb was no more complete than was that of his country. He still considered the slave trade to have been, quote, the line of life which divine providence had allotted me, end quote. He had been in African villages and knew that the people were thoroughly human, and he knew how slaves were obtained. He had seen the branding, the flogging, the use of thumbscrews, the division of Negro girls among the sailors. He had seen enough of West Indian plantations to conclude that they were worse than the slave ships. But Newton had never had the least scruple about the justice of the trade, nor had any friend suggested that it was not a legitimate employment. Quote, inattention and interest, end quote, he later wrote, simply prevented the evil from being perceived. No one realized that not even highway robbery had, quote, a more direct tendency to efface the moral sense, to rob the heart of every gentle and humane disposition, and to harden it like steel against all impressions of sensibility, end quote. Newton's contribution to anti-slavery was therefore a public confession, a decision to speak when he knew that further silence would be quote-unquote criminal, and his uncertain progress towards this decision was virtually an allegory of the progress of Great Britain. And that is the end of chapter 12. And that will take us to, oh, Nambro, hey, you're just coming in just in time. That was the end of the chapter. So that takes us to chapter 13. We have 3 chapters to go to finish out this book. So, yeah. How you doing tonight? I see you came in a few minutes ago. I just noticed. Um, all right. Ooh, man, that reading just it makes me yawn, and it's not because I'm tired. It's the lack of oxygen. I'm breathing out so much that I'm not breathing. I'm breathing in too shallowly. Not getting enough oxygen to the lump of fat between my ears. All right, so I am going to go ahead and end this session and see who's around doing what. I am planning on trying to play a little bit of The Force Unleashed. I finally looked it up and I saw how I'm supposed to get through the problem that I was stuck with. So we'll see. We'll see if I can get it to work. If I can't, I might just switch over to Mass Effect and say the heck with Force Unleashed. So anyway, I will be back in a few minutes. I'll end this session and start the next one up in. I'll go for exactly 11 o'clock. It is 10:53 right now, so 7 minutes. See you then.